This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hello, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. For our first question, Karina from Slovakia says, I'd like to know about the consequences of having an opposite-sex twin on the brain. I've noticed there have been some studies concerning hormones intra-utero.
Exactly. To appreciate this, we have to look at some rodent anatomy, rat or mouse, female, pregnant, and as shown in this diagram, you can see that rats and mice give birth to litters, a whole bunch of pups, up to 20 or so in this diagram, a dozen, 6 on each side. And you'll notice as a key entree to this whole subject is that the circulatory system both involves direct blood delivery to each fetus from the mom, as well as blood flowing bidirectionally among the fetuses. It was a couple of decades ago, a guy named Fred von Saal, University of Missouri, had this really interesting idea. If you are a female fetus and a mom like this during her pregnancy, and you're in the middle of one of these chain sequences of fetuses there, potentially you could be bracketed on either side by a sister, a brother on one side, a sister on the other, or two sisters. And given the blood flow going back and forth between the fetuses, what he wondered was, so do you get a different sort of adult rat or mouse if they're female, for example, they spent pregnancy either side, same sex versus opposite sex siblings? And he was able to first go in some really challenging techniques for blood sampling from fetuses to be able to show that exactly as one would have expected, if you are a female fetus with brothers on each side, the total amount of testosterone that percolates through you over the course of pregnancy is more than if you've got two sisters on each side. So that established, the question then became, so does this produce any differences? And it turned out there was a whole bunch of them. Reproductive ones, behavioral ones, anatomical ones. First off, if you were surrounded by brothers on each side, rather than sisters, if you got the maximal dose of brotherly androgens coming in at you, on the average, you hit puberty later than female surrounded by sisters. On the average, your cycles were less regular, were longer in length. On the average, you had a longer anogenital distance. This is one of those measures if you really want to get to know rodent sexual privates in detail. The anogenital distance is the distance from the anus in the center to the very base of the genitals. And on the average, the anogenital distance in males is longer than in females. So we look at females with sisters on either side versus with brothers. Brothers, you got a longer anogenital distance. In other words, all sorts of markers of mild masculinization, disrupting normal female reproductive physiology. And I think what has been shown since then, among other things, is total lifelong fertility is decreased in females with brothers on each side versus with sisters. One of the things that came out of that literature also was, for totally complicated endocrine reasons that I'm not going anywhere near, these intrauterine neighbor effects were stronger on females than on males. Okay, so now we are not considering humans with a dozen pups growing in there, but as asked in the question, fraternal twins, either same sex or opposite sex. And extending this whole approach, now asking, so are there any differences if you, a female, spent 9 months with your fraternal twin sister versus your fraternal twin brother? In humans, just as in rats, there's some blood flow back and forth between the two fetuses, as well as backflow from each fetus to mom and then back into the other fetus. So intermixing, and what the studies have shown most meaningful is the blood flow between the two twins. So what has been observed, if you were a opposite sex female twin, you sat in there for 9 months with your brother versus a same-sex one, there are some differences. First off is an indication that opposite-sex females were exposed to more testosterone in utero than same-sex females. How can you measure this in a human? Something we've talked about, a totally bizarre, mysterious thing out there in the field that's been a boon for research for reasons I don't think anyone knows, and I've certainly not seen an explanation. The amount of androgens you are exposed to as a fetus alters the ratio of the length of your fourth digit to the second digit. And there's a characteristic skew for males exposed to lots of fetal testosterone, and there's a characteristic skew for females. And what you see from these studies is you look at the opposite sex women, and they have a more masculinized fourth to second finger ratio than you would see with same-sex women. So that suggests, yeah, this really does work out. If you got a brother in there instead of a sister, you're going to be exposed to more cumulative androgens. What other differences come through? Have a brother in there instead of a sister, a brother, your personality tends to be more disinhibited. You tend to show more sensation seeking. You have higher levels of aggression. Lateralization of the brain. There's stuff on one side of the brain that you don't find on the other. And on the average, the male brain is more dramatically lateralized than the female brain. Spend your time in there with a brother, and your brain is going to be more lateralized on the average than if you spent your time in there with a sister. So it increases lateralization. Continuing our weird menagerie of sex hormone dependent things, in addition to the finger ratio business, sit somebody in a totally silent room and there's a very low frequency rumble in the ears called the autoacoustic reflex. And it turns out that on the average, males have lower pitches on theirs than females, and spend your time for 9 months with a brother in there instead of with a sister. As a female, you're going to have a more masculinized autoacoustic reflex. What else do you see? Interestingly, if you are this mildly masculinized female from hanging with your brother all those months and trading blood, you have a decreased likelihood later on of having an eating disorder, which typically show really strong skews towards women and girls having a higher vulnerability. What else do you see? One thing that echoes those classic studies with rats and mice, which is there's a trend in the literature that if you hung out with your brother in utero instead of with a sister, brother, on the average, you hit puberty later. So more stereotypically male personality features, some more stereotypically male aspects of anatomy, and a somewhat masculinized female reproductive system in terms of later onset of puberty. Okay, so that's totally cool, and that suggests there's a whole world of intrauterine, intrasexual, and intersexual effects going on in humans there. There's a confound, though, because not only are we looking at individuals, women who spent 9 months in there with either a brother or a sister, but people who grew up as girls with either a brother or a sister. And there's a huge socialization literature showing that if you're a girl and you're growing up with a twin brother, on the average, you are involved in more rough and tumble play. A bunch of behaviors become somewhat more masculinized. Is this due to the prenatal hormone environment? Or is it due to you got a brother, you wrestle him more than most girls would, and he plays with dolls more than most most boys would, just to go in for some of the reliable stereotypes. Maybe this has nothing to do with the prenatal hormones. Maybe it's just socialization with a same-sex twin versus an opposite-sex twin. And what the really careful versions of these studies have done is a key control. Now compare this female with how many brothers she has who were not fraternal twins, but a little bit older or a little bit younger. In other words, likely to have that same shared environment with an opposite sex sibling of a similar age as with the twin case. And of course, when they're a little bit older or a little bit younger, they're not twins. They didn't share in utero environment. And what you see is the differences that have arisen from this literature are mostly explained by the intrauterine environment, the hormone stuff. Okay, so what one would hope for if you're a nuts and bolts biologist and want to see how this works, do you see genetic differences between women who spent their in utero life with their fraternal brother versus their fraternal sister? And what you should sure expect is there's going to be no genetic differences because you inherit your genome and it's got nothing to do with who you're rubbing elbows with for 9 months in there. You don't see genetic differences, but you see what are termed epigenetic differences, something we've touched on a lot of times. Epigenetics is the means by which environment can cause long-lasting changes in how readily you activate or turn off certain genes. Epigenetic changes coming from environment, traumatic environments as a child, epigenetic changes coming from environment, your mother's bloodstream, epigenetic changes coming from who was sitting next to you in the womb there. And what you see is there are epigenetic differences in genes related to brain development in women who spent their time with a twin brother versus a twin sister. What you see, for those who care about this minutia, is you see epigenetic changes, both at the level of differences of methylation of promoter regions upstream of a gene, and differences in acetylation of the histone, the wrapping around the genes. And this suggests that intrauterine environment winds up being not only different if you have a same-sex versus opposite-sex twin in there, and that these are long-lasting and broad effects. Not massive effects as usual, they're fairly subtle, but nonetheless they're there. So yes, same-sex versus opposite-sex 9-month sojourn inside mom there makes a difference.
Next, Louise from France asks, is foreign accent syndrome for real in terms of neurology, or is it purely psychological?
Oh, foreign accent syndrome, totally irresistible. What's the made-for-TV movie version of it? Somebody has something traumatic happens to them, something neurological, and they wake up the next day with a florid accent of a language group they've never been exposed to, a place they've never gone to. Suddenly, out of nowhere, your Italian grandmother has a Swahili accent. Totally amazing. How does this work? First off, this is for real. Now, to begin to get a sense of it, let's do a quick tour of some bizarrities about accent differences across different language groups, different populations. Cool research, first highlighted in Science in 2015, pointed out different types of ecosystems produce different types of languages with different patterns of intonation, different pitch, different reliance on long or short vowels, sharp consonants or not. And what was found was, across the world, if you get people whose language group evolved in a tropical rainforest, thickly forested, humid, lots of foliage, all of that, you on the average get something different than languages coming from dry, high altitude, cold environments. Wet, humid, leaf-filled rainforest, that's an environment where high-pitched sounds don't come through with much fidelity. And what you see is such languages originating in places like that tend to have lower pitches to the language, more sonorous, more booming speech, longer vowels, less of an emphasis on consonants, slower speech, lower fidelity of what's being said. And then you look at language groups who develop their languages, higher altitude, dry, cold, and you get a very different picture. So that's kind of interesting. Selective forces on making your language most easily comprehensible in the sort of ecosystem you're in. And what's really charming is you look in bird species from around the world and you see the same ecosystem difference. Tropical forest bird types have much lower pitched singing, high altitude, cold, much sharper. So both birds and us have been subject to selection like that. And by the way, that was a study of more than 600 different language groups. What else is interesting? Something I thought was sort of charming that I noted in the literature. So you grow up in some fairly isolated part of the country, and perhaps you go off to college to a very metropolitan area with language accents from all over the place. And one of the inevitable experiences first year in college is if you have a strong regional accent, you get embarrassed if you got a strong Southern accent or a Western twang or a Brooklyn accent, and at least in the experience of a lot of people I know and mine, freshman year was spent with people trying to get rid of their regional accents and get a nice generalized one. Something that was now documented in one study was during COVID, during the isolation of it, all sorts of people had regression back to their childhood regional accents. Another cool one, this was a study that was done a little while back on 11 Antarctic researchers who went to a station down there and were locked up there without anyone visiting them for 4 or 5 months over the course of winter. And the people studying them did careful before and after stuff with their voices, their speech patterns, and they showed that over the course of those 4 to 5 months isolated, those 11 people began to develop a similar accent. And has been pointed out with that, if and when we get around to sending people spending months and months and months in some spaceship going to Mars, out the other end is going to come the very first Martian accents. All right, so it's in that context we can start looking at these weird foreign accent syndromes. First off, is there ever such a thing as foreign language syndrome? Somebody wakes up one day after a neurological accident, some such thing, and suddenly they're fluent in a language they've never heard before. This is a total urban myth. This has never been seen and scientifically documented. But what about foreign accent syndrome? You come out of some sort of challenge, some medical challenge, and you suddenly have a floridly different accent. Yes, this happens. It's extremely rare, though. Less than 100 cases have been studied and documented over the course of the decades. It was first called foreign accent syndrome in 1982. A neurolinguist named Whitaker was the first one to do this. And the first thought that everyone had when seeing somebody has just had an unexpected neurological crisis, they come out the other end with a totally different accent. It's something psychological. It's something psychosomatic. It's something representing the psychological tumult of what they've been through. And you see psychosomatic versions of foreign accent syndrome with some people with schizophrenia that will pop up now and then. Okay, that said, the vast majority of cases of foreign accent syndrome come after something abrupt and unhealthy happening to your brain or the parts of your body that produce language. Most common, more than 50% of cases, after a stroke. Other cases, severe migraine will in rare cases evoke foreign accent syndrome. Individuals who have had jaw surgery, certain dental procedures will provoke that. And what does this foreign accent then look like? There's a change in intonation, there's a change in pitch, there's a change in vowel length, dependence on consonants, there's a change in rhythmicity. And it's very easy to immediately begin to figure out, if you've just had jaw surgery, which has displaced your jaw off an inch to one side, or cancer treatment for jawbone cancer, or so you look at these, and it's not hard to begin to come up with a scenario where some sort of neurological problem, something surgical, something affecting something here, and your language production facility is just changed in some way. Your tongue does something different. You swallow at a different frequency, who knows what, and you produce a different voice than you used to have. And we just fill in the spaces there and decide, ooh, this sounds like an accent from some totally unlikely place. This is the most logical explanation. More common among women than men, and extremely distressful to the people who suffer from it, both because suddenly you got a different voice, you have a different accent. Who am I? Am I still the same person? The other is that most people respond to it assuming it is psychosomatic, it is not some neurological disorder. Okay, so you see these foreign accent syndromes after neurological incidents. Where in the brain are the strokes most frequent? Parts of the brains involved in motoric language production. The motor cortex, the premotor cortex, Broca's area, areas that are very relevant to coordinating your tongue and larynx and epiglottis and whatever stuff you got in there. And this is where there's a change in function afterward that just changes the quality of your speech, and everyone listens to you and says, whoa, it sounds like an accent from this place or that. Foreign accent syndrome. That's the easiest explanation. All it is because of some neurological or surgical tumult, you're just pronouncing stuff differently. Your tongue is sluggish, you slur this, it's just a different sort of voice intonation that you have, and people make up that it sounds like this foreign accent or that foreign one. Two examples that challenge this notion. So we're going to listen to a clip right now of a British woman who, after a stroke, recovered, woke up with a floridly Italian accent. Everyone agrees it sounds completely Italian, and we're going to listen to a clip of it here for a bit.
So they tell me it was stopping the blood flow to the brain.
Yeah.
And so this is the reason for my stroke.
Yeah.
So they remove it on the 1st of August. And then for 2 days, I'm into intensive care because my blood pressure was very low. And the next day, they move me to a ward. The nurse comes to wake me to do blood pressure again, because I worry about it.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty convincingly Italian. Simple explanation. Something just mechanical was damaged after the stroke, and this is an individual who tends to give a sound after syllables. So I am going here. Stereotypically Italian has got nothing to do with Italian culture. It's just a motoric thing. But now let's watch this woman while she's speaking. As you can see, an Afro-British woman with a stroke, and here she is going there. And those of you who are watching it will not only hear the florid Italian accent, but see that she is doing stereotypical Italian hand gestures. As she's emphasizing something, she curls her 4 fingers towards each other and rhythmically brings it from her mouth. This is gestural stuff that arises in Italian culture. Maybe it's something more than just some mechanical speech thing that happens. The other example, here we see a Caucasian British woman who after a stroke emerged with what everyone agreed was now a Chinese accent, and a certain flattening of her intonation, a certain sort of change in mouth shape. Okay, that's easily explained. The same deal again. It's just some mechanical stuff, and you decide, whoa, that kind of sounds like a Chinese accent. But if you listen now, this woman also has some Chinese typical syntax.
I know it's me, but I feel like I want to say, oh, she make a good speak. She speak a good. I have not actually heard my voice in the conversation for nearly 3 years now.
Chinese is one of a lot of East Asian, Southeast Asian languages where you don't have plurals on words. You indicate whether or not it's a plural by the context of what you're saying, the other words surrounding it. And here she is saying things like, I go see many doctor, not doctors, taking on Chinese syntax. So what these rare cases suggest to me is it's not just the mechanical features of your speech has changed and everybody around you projects a new nationality on your speech style. Something more basic and deep is going on there. Remarkable disorder.
Wrapping up, Michał from Poland says, the midlife crisis, is it a biological or cultural phenomenon? And if it's biological, what mechanisms drive it?
Great. Midlife crisis. Midlife crisis stereotypically is this picture of, on the average, people's level of happiness in their 20s, 30s might be up here, and their level of happiness, surprisingly to many, is up around here in their 60s or 70s. But then in the 40 to 60 year, there's a trough. There's this midlife crisis where general sense of well-being on the average goes down. What is this thought to be about? That's when you get to the point in life where you're really beginning to accept your mortality, where you're beginning to truly see what things you were never going to accomplish, what your limitations are. That's when people often suddenly fester in nostalgia for their 20-something or teenage years and make drastic changes and run off and get a new sports car or a new spouse. And this is the picture of it. And all sorts of psychological theorizing has gone into what might cause this. Freud had something to say about it. Jung had something to say. Erik Erikson did as well. One thing that comes through in that literature is the midlife crisis for women is more likely than chance to be centered around them coming to terms with their social roles. With men, it's coming to terms with their work productivity, their work trajectory. Okay, some things that come through the studies. It's independent of the age or number of kids you might have. For the most part, it's independent of socioeconomic status, and we're going to hear some more about that. So one wonders, could there be some confounds coming in here? One would be, is there a survivor effect? So I just said, amid this picture of old age is miserable, on the average, people are the happiest in their lives during their elderly years up until the last few months before their health gets terrible and they die. On the average, people are much happier later in life than in the middle or early on. So insofar as happiness is going to go up then, maybe what the midlife crisis is about is a survivor effect. The people who have actually survived into old age are the people who are disproportionately happy, and that increases the contrast between the two. That would be a confound. People have controlled for that. That's not the case. Next, there may be a cohort effect. What is that? You study a bunch of 50-year-olds and you see the evidence for a midlife crisis. What's the sort of evidence that comes through? Higher rates of alcoholism in that age, higher rates of use of antidepressants, higher rates of depression, higher rates of imprudent financial decisions. People are less happy during that period and they make foolish choices then. So cohort effect. So you're studying a bunch of 50-year-olds who are right in the middle of that 40 to 60 window, and you notice they're all totally depressed. What do you conclude? Whoa, mid-age around there involves people being more prone towards depression, midlife crisis. However, what would be a cohort effect? It has nothing to do with them being 50. It's because these 50-year-olds, when they were kids in the late 1980s, that cohort, they're only now coming to terms with the fact that they're never going to get back a new Cabbage Patch doll, or mullets are never going to be in fashion again. It's not the age, it's the time period at which the age occurred. So people have done controls for that, and it's not cohort effects. So in the West, you see fairly reliably indices of happiness go down during middle age. Now, of course, we have to ask, is this a human universal? And of course, the answer is going to be not especially. Some of the studies have looked at people, 40, 50 different cultures, including some in the developing world, some low-income countries, and some of those studies show something resembling a midlife decline in happiness, well-being in developing countries as well as westernized ones. Some of the studies don't show that. Some of them show that with qualifiers. In India, for example, you see a midlife crisis only among the wealthy. You don't see it in Japan. Some anthropological studies looking at subsistence farming cultures, indigenous cultures, Amazonian horticulturalists, and you don't see anything like that. So it seems to be stronger in the West. And of course, the theorizing immediately plugs into the fact that we in the West live a cult of youth, and disparaging every passing day as we get more decrepit instead of turning into honored village elders. This is a Western phenomenon. So it turns out it may not even be all that consistent of a Western phenomenon. Anthropologist Richard Schwerter, University of Chicago, amazing research, very far-ranging topics. One of his books is called Welcome to Middle Age and Other Cultural Myths. And when he shows is a middle-age doom and gloom, only about 25% of Westerners tend to show that pattern. It's more common among the more economically well-off populations, and it's not all that consistent. All right, so what have we just learned about midlife crisis in humans? It's a Western phenomenon. It's demonstrable. It's demonstrable in a meaningful but still significant subset of Westerners. It's very iffy as to whether you see it in developing cultures. It takes many different forms. Let me tell you about an utterly fascinating study, which for my money shows a midlife crisis, a midlife decline in mood. That is the best study ever done in terms of these controls. Now, this study had 508 subjects, and it was multinational. Subjects were living in the United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, and Singapore. And in this study, rather than giving them questionnaires, they had a different approach where you take somebody who's close to them, who has known them well for at least 2 years in this study, and ask them about this individual as a function of their age. And they were given a 4-question questionnaire, looking at this individual who you have known quite well for a few years. Right now, would you say that their mood is positive or negative today? Okay. Would you say they're getting pleasure from socializing right now? Would you say they're being successful around now at accomplishing their goals? And, great question, would you be willing to trade places with them for a few days? So going through that sort of study, and what it showed was, coming into middle age, a dramatic drop in all these assessments of well-being in these studies, about a 50% decline in these measures of well-being. Okay, so that's pretty interesting, but maybe you could have gotten some more direct data by actually asking the subjects questions, and it wasn't possible. Why was this not possible? Because these were 508 orangutans and chimps living either in zoos in those various countries, sanctuaries, and these were the zookeepers and the researchers and the zoo volunteers who spent every day with these animals, had known them for years. This was asking them to assess the happiness of these animals, and what you saw was a decrease going down around that time of life. Maybe there's a confound that's got something to do with the age of the zookeepers, and not being able to resist, I actually contacted the lead author on that paper and asked, are there differences in the age of the humans who were giving their assessments, and said, no, they actually controlled for that. That wasn't a factor. What's this telling us amid Freudian explanations and coming to terms with mortality and the Western worship of youth and socioeconomic status impacting your likelihood of having this decline of well-being in middle age? You see it in orangutans and chimps. So we're looking at something which I think is not only legit, but is one that predates humanness, is perhaps a general property of apes.
That is it for episode 95. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.